The autumn wind carried secrets through Pine Valley that October morning, the kind that made old-timers pause their coffee and stare toward the mountains like they were listening for something just beyond hearing. Jack Sullivan had been listening to that same wind for 30 years, ever since he'd retreated to Copper Ridge Ranch and built walls higher than any fence could reach. He'd grown comfortable with silence, with the rhythm of cattle and seasons, with the ghost of Sarah's laughter that still echoed in empty rooms when the house settled at night. But comfort, Jack would learn, was just another word for unprepared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other in Jack Sullivan's carefully ordered world. Coffee at 5:30, black and bitter as the Montana dawn. Boots laced tight, hat pulled low, the familiar weight of solitude settling on his shoulders like an old coat. He'd been walking the same fence line for 3 decades, checking the same gates, counting the same cattle, measuring his life in the steady rhythm of routine. The world beyond Copper Ridge Ranch had moved on without him, and that was exactly how he preferred it. Sarah had been gone 8 years now, taken by cancer that ate through her like wildfire through dry grass. The doctors in Billings had used words like aggressive and terminal, but Jack heard only the silence that followed, the way her voice faded from the house until even the echoes disappeared. He'd buried her in the small cemetery behind St. Mary's Chapel, then buried himself in work, in isolation, in the kind of grief that calcifies into something harder than bone. The town of Pine Valley had tried to draw him back at first. Ruth Patterson from the general store would leave casseroles on his porch. Father Mackenzie would ride out monthly with gentle words about healing and community, and Doc Miller would invent reasons to check on his health. But Jack had perfected the art of polite distance, of conversations that went nowhere and invitations that went unanswered. Eventually, they learned to leave him alone with his ghosts. His ranch sat in valley cupped between rolling hills, 3,000 acres of Montana wilderness that had belonged to his family for 4 generations. The house was solid timber and stone, built by his grandfather in 1952, with rooms meant for children and laughter and the kind of life that fills corners with warmth. Instead, it held the echo of one man's footsteps and the weight of everything that might have been. The cattle were Angus, black as the shadows that stretched across the pasture in the early morning light. Jack knew each animal by sight, could tell when one was sick or struggling just by the way it moved. They were easier than people, more predictable than hope. They needed food and water and shelter, and in return they gave him purpose without requiring his heart. On this particular morning, the air held the sharp bite of approaching winter. Frost clung to the fence posts like crystal spider webs, and Jack's breath formed clouds that dissipated in the thin mountain air. He'd been checking the north pasture where the creek ran shallow over smooth stones, the sound of water over rock a constant whisper in the background of his thoughts. The cattle had been restless the night before, moving in tight clusters instead of spreading out to graze, and Jack had learned to trust their instincts about weather and predators. The sun climbed slowly over the eastern ridge, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. Jack paused at the gate that led to the upper pasture, his hands working automatically to check the latch while his mind wandered to the tasks that would fill his day. Hay to move, fences to repair, the endless maintenance that kept a ranch running, and a man from thinking too much about the silence that waited back at the house. He'd been alone so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be surprised. His world had shrunk to the size of what he could see and touch and control, measured in fence lines and feeding schedules and the predictable cycle of seasons. The future stretched ahead like a straight road with no curves, no unexpected turns. Just the steady progression of days that looked exactly like the ones before. The cattle were gathering near the creek when Jack first noticed something was wrong. They stood in a tight semicircle, heads lowered, making the low rumbling sounds that meant distress or confusion. Jack quickened his pace, expecting to find a coyote or maybe a bear, something that would explain their agitation. Instead, he found something that made him question whether he was still dreaming. She was naked, crouched beside the creek like a wild animal drinking, her long dark hair hanging in wet tangles around her shoulders. Her skin was pale as moonlight, unmarked except for scratches from brush and thorns, and she moved with the careful grace of someone who'd forgotten about shame or modesty. Jack stopped dead in his tracks, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. In 30 years of isolation, he'd grown used to the unexpected behavior of animals, but this was something else entirely. The girl couldn't have been more than 25, with the kind of delicate features that belonged in old paintings rather than muddy creek beds. She cupped water in her hands and drank with desperate thirst, her movements quick and furtive like she expected to be driven away. Jack stood frozen, caught between the urge to help and the deeper instinct to retreat, to preserve the careful boundaries he'd built around his life. Then she looked up and saw him, and her eyes went wide with something that might have been recognition or terror. She scrambled backward, slipping on the wet stones, and opened her mouth to scream. But what came out wasn't the sound of fear or pain that Jack expected. Instead, she screamed a name that hit him like a physical blow, stopping his heart and stealing his breath. Sarah! The word tore from her throat with raw desperation, echoing off the hills like a prayer or a curse. Sarah, where are you? Sarah, please! Jack staggered backward, his vision blurring at the edges. The name hung in the air between them like smoke, impossible and real at the same time. His wife had been dead for 8 years, buried and consecrated, ground with a headstone that bore her name and dates, and the words, "Beloved wife," carved in granite. Yet here was a stranger, naked and wild, calling for her like she might actually answer. The girl kept screaming, her voice growing hoarse and desperate. Sarah Sullivan! Sarah, I can't find you. Where did you go? She stood in the creek bed, water streaming from her body, her arms reaching toward nothing. The sound of his dead wife's name in her mouth was obscene, impossible, a violation of everything sacred and private about his grief. Jack's hands shook as he pulled off his jacket, his movements automatic despite the chaos in his mind. He'd been a rancher long enough to know that emergencies required action first and understanding later. Whatever this was, whoever this girl was, she was human and hurt and in need of help. The rest could wait. Miss, he called, his voice rough from disuse and shock. Miss, you need to calm down. You're hurt. You're confused. Let me help you. She turned toward him, and Jack saw that her eyes were the exact shade of green that Sarah's had been, the color of spring grass after rain. The resemblance was so startling that he almost spoke his wife's name himself, almost reached out to touch a face that couldn't possibly be there. But this girl was younger than Sarah had ever been, with features that were similar but not identical, like a reflection in troubled water. You know her, the girl said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than her screams. You know Sarah, I can see it in your face. Where is she? Please, I have to find her. Jack's world tilted on its axis. The morning that had started with such familiar routine now felt like stepping into someone else's dream, a place where the rules he'd lived by for 30 years no longer applied. He looked at this naked stranger who knew his wife's name, who had appeared like a ghost in his pasture, and felt something crack inside his chest that had been frozen solid for 8 years. Sarah's dead, he said quietly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. He'd said them before, to doctors and lawyers and well-meaning neighbors, but never to someone who looked at him with such desperate hope. She died 8 years ago, cancer. The girl's face crumpled, and she sank to her knees in the creek bed, the water rushing around her like liquid crystal. No, she whispered, and then louder, no, that's not right. She's supposed to be here. She told me she'd be here. Jack wrapped his jacket around her shoulders, his hands careful not to touch her skin. She was real, solid, warm with life, and trembling with whatever fever had brought her to his land. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the way her lips were cracked from thirst and her eyes shadowed with something deeper than physical fatigue. "What's your name?" he asked, settling into the tone he used with spooked cattle. Calm and steady and non-threatening. "How do you know about Sarah?" She looked up at him with those impossible green eyes, and Jack saw something flicker behind them, confusion mixed with a kind of desperate certainty. "Emma," she said finally. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My name is Emma, and Sarah was my mother." The words hit Jack like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making the world spin around him. Sarah had never mentioned a daughter, had never spoken of children from a previous relationship, had grieved with him over their own inability to have kids. They'd been married for 15 years before the cancer took her, and Jack thought he'd known everything about the woman he'd loved. But looking at this girl, at the familiar curve of her jaw and the way she held her head, he saw echoes of his wife that couldn't be coincidence. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sarah never had children. She would have told me." Emma shook her head, water droplets flying from her hair. "She gave me up when I was born, but she found me, contacted me. We wrote letters, talked on the phone. She told me about this place, about you. She said if anything ever happened, I should come here. She said you'd understand." Jack's mind reeled, trying to process information that didn't fit with anything he thought he knew about his life. Sarah had been 19 when they met already, living in Pine Valley, working at the diner and saving money for college. She'd never mentioned a past that included a child, never spoken of the kind of loss that giving up a baby would leave behind. But then again, Jack realized he'd never talked about the darkness that had driven him to the ranch in the first place, the reasons he'd chosen isolation over connection. "When did she contact you?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. 3 years ago, Emma said, her voice barely audible over the sound of running water. "She found me through an adoption agency. We were going to meet, but then..." She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears that she didn't seem to notice. Jack did the math in his head. 3 years ago, Sarah had been in the middle of her cancer treatment, fighting a battle she was slowly losing. He remembered how she'd grown quieter during that time, spending long hours staring out the window toward the mountains, writing in a journal she'd never let him read. He'd assumed it was the medication, the way serious illness changes a person's perspective on life and death, and everything in between. "She never told me," he said, and heard the hurt in his own voice. "In all those years, she never said a word." "About you." Emma struggled to her feet, Jack's jacket hanging loose around her small frame. "She wanted to. She said she was going to tell you everything, but then she got sicker, and there wasn't time. She made me promise to wait until after she was gone. She said you'd need time to grieve before you could handle another shock." The girl swayed on her feet, and Jack caught her arm to steady her. Her skin was ice cold, despite the jacket, and he could feel her trembling with exhaustion and something deeper, a kind of spiritual fatigue that comes from carrying too much weight for too long. Whatever had brought her to his ranch, whatever journey had led her to appear naked in his pasture screaming his dead wife's name, it had cost her more than she had to give. "We need to get you to a hospital," he said, automatically falling into the practical mindset that had carried him through every crisis of his adult life. "You're hypothermic, probably dehydrated. There'll be time for talking later." But Emma shook her head with surprising strength. "No hospitals, please, I can't. They'll ask questions I can't answer. They'll want to send me back and I can't." "Go back. Sarah said you'd understand about needing to disappear." Jack looked at her closely, seeing something in her eyes that he recognized from his own mirror during the dark months after Sarah's death. It was the look of someone who'd been hurt beyond the reach of normal healing, someone who'd found the edge of what they could endure and stepped over it into something else entirely. "What are you running from?" he asked, though he suspected. He already knew the answer would be complicated in ways that would make his simple grief seem manageable by comparison. Emma's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Everything," she said. "Everyone. The people who were supposed to love me, the system that was supposed to protect me, the life that was supposed to be mine. Sarah was the only person who ever wanted me. Just because I existed, and now she's gone." Jack felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of isolation he'd carried for 8 years. This girl, this impossible daughter of his dead wife, had appeared in his carefully ordered world like a stone thrown into still water, and the ripples were already spreading beyond his ability to control them. He could send her away, call the authorities, return to his safe routine of grief and solitude. Or he could do what Sarah would have done, what she'd apparently trusted him to do even after death. "Come on," he said, taking her elbow gently. "Let's get you to the house. You can clean up, get some food, and then we'll figure out what happens next." Emma looked up at him with those green eyes that were so much like Sarah's, and Jack saw something that might have been hope struggling to survive in the darkness there. "You believe me?" she asked. "About Sarah, about everything?" Jack considered the question, looking at this strange girl who'd appeared like an answer to a prayer he'd never known how to pray. The rational part of his mind said she was delusional. That grief and desperation had created a fantasy that happened to include his wife's name. But the deeper part of him, the part that had loved Sarah Sullivan with everything he had, recognized something in Emma that couldn't be faked or imagined. "I believe you knew her," he said finally. "And I believe she meant enough to you that you'd risk everything to find her. That's enough for now." They walked toward the house together, the girl wrapped in his jacket and leaning against his arm for support, while behind them the cattle gradually returned to their grazing as if nothing unusual had happened. But Jack knew that everything had changed in the space of a few minutes, that the life he'd built around Sarah's absence now had to make room for her presence in a form he'd never expected. The house looked different as they approached it, less like a mausoleum and more like a place where people actually lived. Emma stumbled once on the porch steps, and Jack caught her, surprised by how light she felt, how fragile. Whatever had brought her to his ranch, she'd paid a price for the journey. That showed in every line of her body. "Sarah used to sit right there," Emma said, pointing to the porch swing that Jack hadn't touched in 8 years. "She wrote about it in her letters. She said it was her favorite place in the whole world, watching the sun set over the mountains. While you finished your work in the barn." Jack's throat tightened. Sarah had indeed loved that swing, had spent countless evenings there with a book or a cup of tea, waiting for him to come home from whatever task had kept him late, he'd avoided. It's since her death, unable to bear the sight of the empty space where she used to sit. "She wrote about a lot of things," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger now that she was talking about Sarah. "About how quiet it was here, how the stars looked different than anywhere else she'd ever lived. She said this place saved her, gave her the kind of peace she'd never thought she'd find." They reached the front door, and Jack paused with his hand on the knob. For 8 years he'd been the only person to cross this threshold, the only one to disturb the careful preservation of Sarah's memory that he'd maintained in every room. Now he was about to bring in a stranger who claimed to be his wife's daughter, someone who might shatter the fragile equilibrium he'd built around his grief. But as he looked at Emma, shivering in his jacket with her dark hair tangled around her shoulders and her eyes full of desperate hope, Jack realized that maybe his equilibrium had already been shattered. Maybe it had been broken from the moment Sarah died, and he'd just been too afraid to admit it. Maybe this girl, impossible as she seemed, was exactly what he needed to finally start putting the pieces back together. He opened the door and stepped aside to let her enter first, and as she crossed the threshold into his house, Jack felt something shift inside him that had been frozen solid for 8 years. The silence that had been his constant companion suddenly felt less like protection and more like a prison, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he found himself curious about what tomorrow might bring. The interior of Jack Sullivan's house felt like stepping into a photograph that had been sealed away from time. Every surface gleamed with the obsessive care of a man who had nothing but hours to fill. Yet underneath the polish lay the unmistakable weight of preservation rather than living. Emma's bare feet made soft sounds on the hardwood floors as she moved through the entryway, her eyes taking in details that seemed to confirm everything Sarah had written about in her letters. The living room stretched before them with its stone fireplace and leather furniture, everything positioned exactly as it had been when Sarah was alive. Jack watched Emma's face as she absorbed the space, noting how her expression shifted from wonder to something deeper, more complex. She moved toward the mantelpiece where photographs stood in neat rows, her fingers hovering just above the frames without quite touching them. "She told me about this one," Emma whispered, pointing to a picture of Sarah laughing beside a Christmas tree, her hair caught in morning light streaming through the windows. "She said it was taken the year before she got sick, when everything still felt possible." Jack's chest tightened at the memory. He'd taken that photograph on Christmas morning, catching Sarah in an unguarded moment as she unwrapped a sweater he'd bought her in town. She'd thrown her head back and laughed at something ridiculous he'd said, and the camera had captured the pure joy that radiated from her like heat from a flame. It had been one of their last truly carefree holidays before the symptoms started, before the word cancer entered their vocabulary and changed the meaning of every day. "She kept every letter you wrote her," Emma said, still staring at the photograph. "I found them after she died, tied up with a blue ribbon in a box under her bed. She wrote about this house like it was a sanctuary, like it was the first place she'd ever felt truly safe." The revelation hit Jack like cold water. Sarah had died in a hospice facility in Billings, her final weeks spent in sterile rooms that smelled of disinfectant and industrial cleaning supplies. He'd wanted to bring her home, to let her spend her last days surrounded by the things she loved, but the medical equipment and round-the-clock care had made it impossible. He'd never known she'd been writing letters during that time, never imagined she was sharing their private world with someone he'd never met. "Where were you living when she contacted you?" Jack asked, settling onto the edge of the sofa while Emma continued to examine the photographs. The question felt safer than asking about the letters, less likely to crack open emotions he wasn't sure he could handle. Emma's hand stilled on the mantelpiece, and when she turned to face him, her expression had hardened into something defensive and careful. "Foster care," she said simply. "I've been in the system since I was born. Sarah found me through the adoption agency when I turned 18 and aged out." Jack had dealt with enough wounded animals to recognize the signs of someone who'd learned to protect themselves by revealing as little as possible. The way Emma held her shoulders, the careful distance she maintained even while wearing his jacket, the way her eyes kept tracking toward the door despite her apparent fascination with the photographs all spoke of someone who'd learned that safety was temporary and trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Was it difficult?" he asked, then immediately regretted the question. Of course it had been difficult. Foster care wasn't known for producing well-adjusted adults, especially ones who appeared naked in remote pastures screaming for dead women. Emma's laugh held no humor. 18 years of being nobody's priority tends to leave marks, she said. But Sarah, when she contacted me, it was like finding out I actually existed. Like I wasn't just this random person taking up space in the world. She wanted to know everything about me, not because she needed something, but because she genuinely cared about who I'd become. Jack watched her move around the room, noting how she seemed to catalog every detail as if she were memorizing evidence of Sarah's life. She paused at the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of novels and poetry collections that Sarah had loved, and Jack saw recognition flash across her face. "She sent me this one," Emma said, pulling out a worn copy of Mary Oliver's poetry. She said it helped her understand how to find peace in difficult places. "I read it so many times the binding fell apart." The book fell open in Emma's hands to a page marked with a pressed flower, and she read aloud in a voice that grew stronger with each word. "Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" Jack remembered Sarah reading those same lines during her illness, remembered how she'd clung to the idea that even in dying, she could choose how to spend the time she had left. He'd found the poetry frustrating then, too abstract to provide comfort in the face of practical loss. But hearing the words in Emma's voice, seeing how they'd traveled from Sarah to this strange girl and back to his living room, he began to understand that some connections transcended the simple mathematics of life and death. "She was trying to prepare me," Emma continued, closing the book carefully. In her letters she kept talking about choices and courage and what it meant to build a life worth living. "I thought she was just being philosophical, but now I think she knew she was running out of time to say everything she needed to say." Jack stood and moved to the kitchen, needing the familiar ritual of making coffee to ground himself in something concrete. The kitchen was Sarah's domain, the one room in the house where her presence felt strongest. Her apron still hung on hooks beside the stove, her coffee mugs arranged in the cabinet exactly as she'd left them. Emma followed him, settling onto one of the high stools at the breakfast bar, while he busied himself with measuring grounds and filling the pot with water. "She wrote about this kitchen," Emma said, her voice soft with something that might have been reverence. "She said it was where she felt most like herself, where she could think clearly about what mattered. She said you used to sit right there in the mornings, reading the newspaper while she made pancakes, and it was the closest thing to perfect she'd ever experienced." Jack's hands stilled on the coffee maker. Saturday morning pancakes had been their tradition, a weekly ritual that had marked the rhythm of their marriage more reliably than any calendar. Sarah would stand at the stove in her blue robe, hair twisted up in a messy bun, humming softly while she flipped perfect golden circles. Jack would pretend to read the paper while actually watching her, amazed every week that this woman had chosen to build a life with him in this remote corner of Montana. "How much did she tell you?" he asked, not sure he wanted to know the answer. "About us, about our life here." Emma was quiet for a long moment, and Jack could feel her choosing her words carefully. "She told me you saved her," she said finally. "She said she came to Pine Valley running from something, and you gave her a place where she could stop running. She said you never asked her to be anything other than who she was, and that was the first time anyone had ever loved her without conditions." The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence with familiar sounds, while Jack processed Emma's words. Sarah had indeed been running when they met, though she'd never told him the full story of what she was fleeing. He'd been content to love her present without demanding access to her past, the same way she'd accepted his own need for isolation without pressing him for explanations he wasn't ready to give. "She was pregnant when you met her, wasn't she?" Emma said, and Jack's world tilted sideways. He turned to stare at her, the coffee forgotten as his mind raced through memories he'd thought he understood. Sarah had been thin when they met, almost gaunt, with the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying too much weight for too long. He'd attributed it to whatever she was running from, to the kind of stress that burns through a person's reserves and leaves them hollow. It had never occurred to him that she might have been recovering from childbirth, from the physical and emotional trauma of giving up a baby. "She told me she'd just given birth to me when she arrived in Pine Valley," Emma continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "She said she'd been living with a family who promised to help her, but they just wanted to control her. When she realized they were going to take me away regardless of what she wanted, she signed the papers and left. She said it was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but she wanted me to have a chance at a better life than she could provide. Jack sank onto the stool across from Emma, his legs suddenly unsteady. The woman he'd loved for 15 years, the woman he'd thought he knew completely, had been carrying the weight of this loss from the very beginning of their relationship. Every day they'd spent together, every moment of happiness they'd shared, had been built on top of a grief so profound that she'd never felt safe enough to share it with him. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Sarah had been protective of her pain, careful not to burden others with weights they couldn't carry. And Jack, wrapped up in his own need for peace and simplicity, might not have been ready to handle the complexity of loving someone who was mourning a child she'd never been allowed to keep. She wanted to, Emma said. In her letters she talked about how many times she'd almost told you, especially when you two were trying to have children of your own. She said the guilt was eating her alive, knowing she already had a daughter somewhere while you both grieved for the babies that never came. Jack remembered those years of disappointment, the monthly cycle of hope and loss that had eventually led them to stop trying altogether. Sarah had suggested adoption once, but when Jack expressed reluctance about raising someone else's child, she'd never brought it up again. Now he understood the depth of that conversation, the way his casual dismissal must have felt like a rejection of not just an idea but of the daughter she'd already lost. "She was protecting you," Emma continued. "She said you'd built such a peaceful life together, and she couldn't bear the thought of introducing chaos into something so perfect. She was afraid that if you knew about me, it would change how you saw her, make you wonder what other secrets she was keeping." Jack poured coffee into 2 mugs, his hands moving automatically while his mind struggled to reframe every memory he'd thought he understood. The woman who'd made him breakfast every morning, who'd shared his bed and his dreams and his quiet contentment, had been carrying a secret that shaped every aspect of who she was. The strength he'd admired in her, the way she'd seemed to understand loss without him having to explain it, the patience she'd shown with his own need for solitude, all made sense now in a way that left him breathless. "When did she decide to contact you?" he asked, sliding a mug across the counter to Emma. 3 years ago, when she got diagnosed," Emma said, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. She said facing her own mortality made her realize she couldn't take the secret to her grave. She wanted to know what had happened to me, wanted to make sure I was okay, even if she could never be part of my life. Jack's throat tightened as he imagined Sarah sitting in a doctor's office, hearing words like malignant and metastasized, thinking not just about her own future, but about the daughter she'd never known. The courage it must have taken to reach out after 20 years of silence, to risk opening wounds that had never properly healed, spoke to a kind of love that Jack was only beginning to understand. What was she like in her letters? He asked, needing to know how Sarah had presented herself to this daughter who'd been a stranger. Emma's face softened, and for the first time since she'd appeared in his pasture, she looked genuinely peaceful. "She was funny," she said. "I wasn't expecting that. She'd write these long descriptions of your cattle and how they each had different personalities, or she'd tell stories about the people in town and their various dramas. She made this place sound like a world unto itself, complete and self-contained." Jack smiled despite himself. Sarah had indeed found endless entertainment in the quirks and conflicts of Pine Valley's small population. She'd had a gift for seeing the humor in human nature without being cruel about it, for finding stories worth telling in the mundane interactions of daily life. But she was also honest about the hard things, Emma continued. She didn't try to pretend that giving me up was anything other than devastating, or that she'd stopped thinking about me every day for 20 years. She said the wondering was the worst part, not knowing if I was safe, if I was loved, if I'd grown up to be happy. Jack set down his coffee mug with deliberate care, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile intimacy of this conversation. Emma was offering him glimpses into a version of Sarah he'd never known existed. A woman who'd been simultaneously the person he'd loved and someone else entirely. The duality was disorienting, like discovering that familiar landscape had hidden depths he'd never suspected. "She wanted to meet you," Emma said quietly. "She'd been working up the courage to ask me to visit when the cancer got worse. She said she dreamed about introducing us, about the three of us sitting in this kitchen, sharing breakfast while you read the paper out loud. She thought maybe you'd like me, maybe I could be the daughter you never had." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and loss in equal measure. Jack could picture the scene Emma described, could imagine Sarah nervous and excited as she made introductions between the two people who mattered most to her. But that future had died with Sarah, leaving behind only this strange present where he was meeting his wife's daughter for the first time in a kitchen that suddenly felt both familiar and completely transformed. Emma slid off her stool and moved to the window above the sink, looking out toward the pasture where Jack had found her hours earlier. Her reflection in the glass showed a young woman who looked exhausted and lost, but also determined in a way that reminded Jack powerfully of Sarah when she'd set her mind to something. "She told me about the swing on the porch," Emma said without turning around. "She said if anything ever happened to her, if I ever needed a place to go, I should come here. She said you'd understand what it meant to need somewhere safe to heal." Jack joined her at the window, close enough to see the exhaustion in her reflection, but careful not to crowd her. "What happened to you, Emma? What brought you here like this?" She was quiet for so long that Jack thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she was afraid that speaking too loudly might make her words more real than she could handle. "The last foster family," she said. "The Hendersons. They seemed nice at first. Normal, but Mr. Henderson, he had ideas about what young women owed him for his kindness. And when I tried to leave, tried to report him, Mrs. Henderson said I was lying, that I was just another troubled foster kid making up stories for attention." Jack's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice calm. "How did you get away?" Emma's reflection smiled bitterly in the window. "I waited until they were both asleep and took their car. Drove as far as the gas money would take me, then started walking. I've been traveling for 3 weeks, sleeping rough, trying to get here before winter set in too hard." Jack's mind raced, calculating distances and timelines. Emma would have had to cross multiple states to reach Montana, would have covered hundreds of miles on foot after abandoning the stolen car. The fact that she'd made it at all spoke to a kind of desperate determination that Jack recognized from his own darkest moments. "The clothes?" he asked. "Lost them crossing a river in Wyoming," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Current was stronger than I expected. I managed to save Sarah's letters and kept walking. I figured if I was going to die, I'd rather do it trying. To reach the place she described, then give up somewhere else." Jack felt something crack open in his chest, a place that had been frozen solid since Sarah's death. This girl had risked everything to reach a place she'd only known through letters, guided by nothing more than her dead mother's description of safety and the hope that a stranger might honor promises Sarah had never been able to make herself. "You could have died," he said. Emma turned from the window to face him, and Jack saw that her green eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I was already dying," she said simply, "just slower. Sarah's letters were the first time anyone ever told me I mattered just because I existed, not because of what I could do for them. When she died, I lost the only person who'd ever wanted me. I figured if I could make it here, to the place where she'd been happy, maybe I could understand what that felt like." Jack looked at this young woman who'd walked across states to reach a place she'd never seen, who'd appeared in his pasture like an answer to prayers he'd never known how to voice, and felt the walls he'd built around his grief begin to shift and crack. Emma wasn't just Sarah's daughter, she was living proof that love could transcend death, that the connections that mattered most found ways to survive even the most impossible circumstances. She was happy here, he said, his voice rough with emotion he'd been holding back for 8 years. The happiest I ever saw her. And she would have loved you, Emma. She would have been so proud of your courage, of the woman you've become despite everything you've survived. Emma's tears finally spilled over, and Jack had to resist the urge to reach out and comfort her. She'd been hurt too much by people who were supposed to protect her, and he understood that trust would have to be earned slowly, carefully, through actions rather than words. I don't know what happens now, Emma said, wiping her face with the sleeve of his jacket. I don't have anywhere else to go, but I can't stay here forever. I'm not even sure I'm really Sarah's daughter, or if I just wanted it to be true so badly that I convinced myself. Jack studied her face, seeing Sarah in the curve of her cheekbones and the stubborn set of her jaw, but seeing someone entirely unique as well. Whether or not DNA would confirm what his heart was already beginning to accept, this girl had loved Sarah enough to cross the country looking for her. That was enough to matter, enough to change everything. There's time to figure it out, he said. For now you need rest and food and time to heal. The rest can wait. Part 3. First contact and resistance. The immediate practicalities of having another person in the house hit Jack with unexpected force as he led Emma upstairs to what had once been Sarah's sewing room. The space had been converted into a guest bedroom years ago, though no guest had ever used it. Everything was clean and ready, but it felt strange to be opening doors and turning on lights for someone else. Strange to hear footsteps other than his own on the creaking floorboards. Emma moved through the small room like someone afraid to disturb anything, her hands hovering near surfaces without quite touching them. The afternoon light streaming through the single window revealed the extent of her exhaustion more clearly. Scratches on her arms from brush and brambles, dirt under her fingernails, the hollow look of someone who'd been running on adrenaline for too long. There's a bathroom through that door, Jack said, pointing to a door that connected the guest room to the main hallway. Towels in the cabinet, and I'll find some clothes that might fit you. Sarah's things are still. He paused, realizing he'd never had to explain to anyone why he'd kept his dead wife's belongings. I understand, Emma said quietly. Letting go is harder than holding on sometimes. Jack nodded, grateful that he didn't have to justify choices that probably looked unhealthy to an outside observer. I'll leave some things on the bed. Take as long as you need. He retreated to his and Sarah's bedroom, closing the door behind him before opening the dresser drawer that held her clothes. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, organized by color and season in the methodical way that had been one of her countless small kindnesses to her future self. Jack had touched these things only to wash and fold them, maintaining them like a shrine to normalcy. Choosing clothes for Emma felt like a violation of Sarah's privacy, even though Sarah was beyond caring about such things. Jack selected practical items: jeans that would be too big, but workable with a belt, a soft sweater in forest green that had been one of Sarah's favorites, underwear that had never been worn because Sarah had bought it just before getting sick and never had occasion to use it. As he laid the clothes on Emma's bed, Jack caught himself listening for sounds from the bathroom: running water, the soft thud of towels being moved, evidence that this wasn't all an elaborate hallucination brought on by too much isolation and grief. The presence of another person in his house felt surreal, like waking up to find the furniture rearranged by invisible hands. When Emma emerged from the bathroom an hour later, clean and dressed in Sarah's clothes, Jack had to grip the kitchen counter to steady himself. The resemblance was even stronger now that the grime and exhaustion had been washed away. Emma was thinner than Sarah had ever been, and younger, but the way she moved, the way she held her head, the particular shade of her hair when it caught the light, all spoke of genetic connections that couldn't be faked. They fit better than I expected, Emma said, running her hands down the front of the sweater. It feels strange wearing her clothes, like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not. Jack poured himself another cup of coffee, needing something to do with his hands. Sarah would have liked sharing with you, he said. She was generous that way, always finding excuses to give things to people who needed them more. Emma settled onto the same stool she'd occupied earlier, but now she looked more like a person and less like a refugee. Tell me about her, she said. Not the things she wrote in letters, but what she was really like, the small things that made her who she was. Jack considered the request, surprised by how difficult it was to answer. He'd spent 8 years thinking about Sarah every day, but always in the context of missing her, of grieving what they'd lost. Talking about who she'd actually been, separate from his own sense of loss, required a different kind of emotional archaeology. She hummed when she was content, he said finally. Not any particular song, just these little melodies she'd make up while she was cooking or reading or working in the garden. I didn't realize how much I'd gotten used to it until it stopped. Emma smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness Jack had seen from her. She mentioned that in one of her letters. She said music helped her think, helped her feel connected to something larger than herself. Jack found himself relaxing into the conversation, discovering that talking about Sarah felt different when he was sharing her with someone who'd loved her too, rather than explaining her to people who'd never known her at all. She couldn't carry a tune to save her life, he continued, but she sang anyway, usually while she was in the garden. The plants seemed to like it. They grew better for her than they ever did for me. What did she plant? Emma asked, leaning forward with interest that seemed genuine rather than polite. Everything, Jack said. Vegetables, herbs, flowers. She said a garden should feed all the senses, not just hunger. She'd plant marigolds next to the tomatoes because the colors made her happy, and lavender near the back door, so the whole house would smell like summer when the wind was right. Jack paused, remembering the hours Sarah had spent on her knees in the dirt, planning and planting and tending with the kind of focused attention she brought to everything she cared about. After she died, he'd maintained the garden mechanically, keeping things alive without really understanding why any of it mattered. The garden's still there, he said. Overgrown now, but the perennials come back every year. I never had the heart to till it under, but I never had the energy to really care for it either. Emma was quiet for a moment, and Jack could see her processing information, fitting pieces together in ways he couldn't anticipate. She wrote about teaching me to garden, she said finally. She said she wanted to show me how to grow things. From seed, how to be patient with growth that happens too slowly to see from day to day. The image of Sarah and Emma working together in the garden, heads bent over seedlings and soil, hit Jack with unexpected force. It was a future that had been stolen by cancer and time, and the complicated mathematics of secrets kept too long. But sitting in his kitchen with Emma wearing Sarah's clothes and asking about Sarah's flowers, Jack could almost see how it might have been. She would have taught you everything, he said. Sarah believed that knowledge was meant to be shared, that the point of learning anything was to pass it on to someone who could use it. Emma stood and moved to the window again, looking out toward the backyard, where the remains of Sarah's garden were visible as geometric shapes in the landscape. Could you show me? She asked without turning around. I know I can't stay here, but while I'm here, could you teach me what she would have taught me? Jack felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight control he'd maintained over every aspect of his life since Sarah's death. The idea of working in the garden again, of bringing it back to life with someone who would have mattered to Sarah, felt both terrifying and necessary. It's late in the season, he said. Most things are finished for the year. But some things can be planted in fall, right? Emma turned to face him, and Jack saw hope struggling with expectation in her expression. She wrote about preparing beds for spring, about bulbs that need winter cold to bloom properly. Jack nodded despite himself. Sarah had indeed loved fall planting, the act of faith required to bury bulbs in frozen ground and trust that spring would bring them back to life. Tulips and daffodils, he said. Crocuses, we could do that. Emma's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face and making her look younger than her years. She would have liked that, wouldn't she? Knowing we were planting things together? Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion he wasn't prepared to handle. She would have loved it. He said honestly. Sarah believed in continuity, in things that lasted longer than any one person's lifetime. They were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle coming up the long gravel drive that led to the house. Jack tensed automatically. Visitors were rare, and unexpected visitors were almost unheard of. Through the kitchen window, he could see a familiar pickup truck raising dust as it approached, and he relaxed slightly when he recognized Billy Crawford behind the wheel. "It's just my neighbor," Jack told Emma, noting how her entire body had gone rigid at the sound of the approaching vehicle. Billy Crawford. His ranch borders mine to the east. He checks on me sometimes, makes sure I haven't died and left the cattle to fend for themselves. Emma's hands were shaking as she set down her coffee mug. "I should go upstairs," she said. "I shouldn't be here when he arrives. People will ask questions." Jack could see the fear in her eyes, the way her breathing had quickened at the thought of having to explain herself to a stranger. Whatever Emma had been through in the weeks before arriving at his ranch, it had left her with the kind of hypervigilance that comes from being hunted. "You don't have to hide," Jack said gently. "Billy's a good man, and he's not the type to spread gossip. But if you'd be more comfortable upstairs, that's fine too." Emma was already moving toward the staircase, but she paused at the foot of the steps. "What will you tell him about me being here?" Jack considered the question, realizing that this was the first time he'd have to explain Emma's presence to anyone. The truth was too complicated and too private to share with a neighbor, but lies had never come easily to him. "I'll tell him. You're a friend of Sarah's who needed a place to stay," Jack said. "It's not untrue." Emma nodded and disappeared up the stairs, just as Billy's truck pulled into the yard. Jack watched through the window as his neighbor climbed out of the cab, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had been shaped by decades of physical labor. Billy was 15 years younger than Jack but looked older, his face weathered by wind and sun into the kind of permanent squint that marked lifelong ranchers. Jack opened the front door before Billy could knock, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door behind him. It was a subtle signal that this conversation would happen outside, but Billy was perceptive enough to understand without needing explanation. "Afternoon, Jack," Billy said, touching the brim of his hat in the casual greeting that passed for formal manners in their part of Montana. "Thought I'd stop by, see how you're holding up with this cold snap coming in." Jack nodded, grateful for the ordinary nature of the conversation. "Cattle are ready for it. Got them moved to the lower pasture yesterday. Plenty of shelter and easy access to feed." Billy's eyes swept over the property with the automatic assessment of a man who understood the rhythms of ranch life. "Heard you might have company," he said casually, and Jack felt his stomach drop. "Oh?" Jack kept his voice level, though his mind was racing. Pine Valley was small enough that news traveled fast, but he couldn't imagine how word of Emma's arrival could have spread when she'd been here less than a day. "Ruth Patterson mentioned seeing smoke from your chimney at odd hours," Billy said. "Said it looked like you were keeping longer fires than usual for a man living alone." Jack relaxed slightly. Ruth Patterson ran the general store and had the unfortunate combination of sharp eyes and an overactive imagination. If she was drawing conclusions from fireplace smoke, she didn't actually know anything concrete. "Had some trouble with the heating system," Jack said, which was technically true. He'd been building larger fires to combat the chill that seemed to have settled into his bones since Emma's arrival. though the cold he was fighting was more emotional than physical. Billy nodded, accepting the explanation without question. "Well, if you need help with repairs, you know where to find me. Martha's got me fixing every broken thing on our place, so I'm getting plenty of practice." Jack smiled at the mention of Billy's wife, a woman who believed that ranch life was just an endless series of maintenance projects interrupted by brief periods of rest. "How is Martha?" "Good. Busy planning for Thanksgiving, even though it's still a month away. She mentioned you ought to come for dinner this year, said it's been too long since you socialized with actual people." The invitation hung in the air between them, loaded with the kind of gentle concern that longtime neighbors showed for each other without making it feel like charity. Jack had declined similar invitations for 8 years, preferring the solitude that felt safer than attempting normal human interaction. "I'll think about it," Jack said, surprised to realize he actually meant it. Having Emma in the house had reminded him what it felt like to share space with another person, to have conversations that went beyond weather and cattle prices. Billy studied Jack's face with the careful attention of someone who'd known him long enough to notice subtle changes. "You look different," he said finally. "Better somehow. More like yourself than you've been in a long time." Jack felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed to realize that Emma's presence had affected him in ways that were apparently visible to others. "Just getting more sleep, I guess." Billy grinned, the expression making him look younger and more mischievous. "Well, whatever it is, keep it up. Sarah wouldn't want you turning into a hermit permanently." The casual mention of his wife's name hit Jack like a physical blow, but instead of the usual sharp pain, he felt something softer, more complex. For the first time in 8 years, someone had mentioned Sarah in the context of what she would want for him, rather than what he'd lost when she died. "She wouldn't," Jack agreed quietly. Sarah always believed in moving forward, even when it seemed impossible. Billy clapped him on the shoulder with rough affection. "Smart woman. Always liked that about her. She saw things clearly, didn't get caught up in drama or nonsense." After Billy left, Jack stood on the porch for a long time, watching the dust settle from his neighbor's departure and thinking about the conversation. The casual mention of Sarah, the observation that he looked better, the invitation to Thanksgiving dinner, all of it felt like evidence that his carefully constructed isolation was beginning to crack in ways that might actually be healthy. When he finally went back inside, Emma was sitting at the kitchen table with one of Sarah's photo albums open in front of her. She looked up when he entered, her expression guilty and defensive. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was looking for the bathroom and saw this on the bookshelf. I shouldn't have touched it without asking." Jack looked at the album, recognizing it as one of the ones Sarah had put together during their early years of marriage. The photo showed a younger version of himself and Sarah, captured in moments of casual happiness that seemed impossibly distant now. "It's all right," Jack said, settling into the chair across from her. Sarah made those albums to be looked at, not to gather dust on shelves. Emma turned the page, revealing a photo of Sarah in the garden, her hands dirty and her face bright with satisfaction as she held up a basket of tomatoes. "She looks so happy," Emma said softly. "In all these pictures, she just radiates contentment." Jack studied the photo, remembering the day it was taken. Sarah had been experimenting with heirloom varieties of tomatoes, trying to find ones that would thrive in Montana's short growing season. She'd been absurdly proud of that particular harvest, treating each perfect tomato like a personal victory. She was happy, Jack said. Happier than she'd ever been, she used to tell me. But looking at these pictures now, knowing what I know about you, I can see something else too. Emma looked at him questioningly, and Jack pointed to the photo. "Look at her eyes," he said. "Even in her happiest moments, there's a shadow there. Something held back, something incomplete." Emma studied the photo more closely, and Jack saw recognition dawn in her expression. She was thinking about me, she said softly. Even when she was happy, part of her was wondering about the daughter she'd given up. Jack nodded, feeling pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed finally clicking into place. I used to think that shadow was about her past, whatever she was running from when we met. But now I think it was about you. She was carrying the weight of missing you every single day. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away from the photo. I used to wonder about her too, she said. The social workers told me my birth mother was young and scared, that she gave me up because she loved me too much to keep me. Emma's hands trembled as she traced the edges of the photograph, her fingertips barely making contact with the glossy surface where Sarah's image smiled back at them both. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the kitchen air, mixing with the lingering scent of coffee and the faint lavender that still clung to Sarah's sweater despite years of careful storage. I never let myself imagine what she looked like. When she was thinking about me, Emma whispered, her voice catching on emotions too complex to name. It hurt too much to think that somewhere out there, someone might actually care whether I was alive or dead. Jack watched her struggle with revelations that were reshaping everything she'd believed about her place in the world. The careful walls she'd built around her heart were cracking, and he could see her fighting the urge to retreat into the safety of emotional numbness that had probably kept her alive through 18 years of institutional care. The wondering goes both ways, Jack said gently. Sarah used to stare out at the horizon sometimes, especially in the evenings when the light was soft like this. I thought she was just appreciating the view, but now I think she was imagining where you might be, what you might be doing at that exact moment. Emma closed the photo album with deliberate care, as if the images inside were too fragile to bear repeated viewing. When she looked up at Jack, her green eyes were bright with unshed tears and something that might have been the beginning of hope. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, then stopped and shook her head. "I don't even know what to call you. You're not my stepfather, not exactly, but you're the closest thing to family I've ever had." Jack felt his throat tighten at the simple honesty of her words. He'd spent 8 years defining himself primarily as Sarah's widower, a man whose most important relationship existed only in memory. The idea that he might be something meaningful to this young woman, something more than just a keeper of his dead wife's secrets, was both terrifying and oddly comforting. "Jack is fine," he said, "or whatever feels right to you. We don't need to figure out all the labels right away." Emma nodded, but Jack could see her mind working, processing the strange dynamics of their situation. She was Sarah's daughter and his houseguest, a living connection to his wife and a complete stranger, someone who belonged in his life and had no rightful place in it all at the same time. "I should probably call someone," Emma said suddenly, her voice taking on the flat tone that Jack was beginning to recognize as her way of handling overwhelming emotions. "Let people know I'm safe, that I'm not lying dead in a ditch somewhere." Jack studied her carefully. "Is there someone who's actually worried about you? Someone who would care about that phone call?" Emma's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "The Hendersons probably reported their car stolen by now. My caseworker might have noticed I missed a check-in, though she's got so many kids on her roster that it could be weeks before she gets around to following up. But honestly, I don't think anyone's losing sleep over my whereabouts." The casual way she spoke about her own expendability hit Jack like a physical blow. He'd spent 30 years taking for granted that his absence would be noticed, that his well-being mattered to at least a few people in the world. The idea of moving through life with such profound disconnection from any safety net was almost incomprehensible. "What about friends?" he asked. "People your own age who might be wondering where you are?" Emma shook her head, and Jack saw years of practiced isolation in the gesture. "Foster kids learn not to get too attached to anyone. You get moved around too much, separated too often. It's easier to keep to yourself than to keep saying goodbye to people you care about." Jack thought about his own self-imposed isolation, the way he'd withdrawn from community and connection after Sarah's death. But his solitude had been a choice born of grief, a temporary retreat that had become habit. Emma's isolation had been thrust upon her from birth, a survival mechanism that had calcified into a worldview where genuine connection seemed impossible. Sarah was the first person who ever asked me about my dreams, Emma continued, her voice soft with memory. Not what I wanted to do for work or where I wanted to live, but what I dreamed about at night. She said dreams were windows into the parts of ourselves we didn't know how to access any other way. Jack remembered Sarah's fascination with dreams and their meanings. She'd kept a journal beside their bed for years, recording fragments of nighttime visions that she'd analyze over morning coffee with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. "What did you tell her?" Jack asked, genuinely curious about what dreams might visit someone whose waking life had been shaped by constant uncertainty. Emma was quiet for a long moment, and Jack could see her deciding whether to trust him with something that felt too precious to share. "I dreamed about horses," she said finally. "Wild horses running across open plains, free and fast and belonging to no one. In the dreams, I was running with them, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to move without fear." Jack felt something twist in his chest at the image. He owned horses, had grown up around them, took their presence in his life for granted in the way that people born to ranching often did. But hearing Emma describe the freedom they represented to someone who'd never known genuine liberty made him see his own animals with different eyes. "There are horses here," he said quietly, "in the barn, and others that run loose in the high pasture during the summer months." Emma's eyes widened with something that might have been longing or might have been fear. "Sarah mentioned them in her letters. She said you had a mare named Luna who was gentle enough for beginners, but spirited enough to make riding feel like flying." Jack nodded, surprised by how accurately Sarah had captured Luna's personality in her correspondence. The gray mare was indeed the perfect combination of calm and responsive, a horse who seemed to understand that trust was something that had to be earned slowly. "She's still here," Jack said. "Getting older like all of us still sound." Sarah used to ride her along the creek bed in the evenings, said it was the best way to clear her head after difficult days. Emma stood abruptly and moved to the window that faced the barn, as if she could see through the wooden walls to the horses inside. "I've never been on a horse," she said. "Never even touched one, except in dreams." Jack joined her at the window, studying her profile as she stared toward the barn with naked yearning. "We could change that," he said, "if you wanted to. Luna's patient with nervous riders." Emma turned to look at him, and Jack saw something shift in her expression, walls lowering just enough to let possibility seep through. "You'd teach me?" Jack nodded, surprised by how much he wanted to share this part of his world with her. "Sarah would have wanted that," he said. She believed everyone should know what it felt like to communicate with an animal that large and powerful through nothing but trust and intention. Emma's smile was tentative but genuine, the first expression of pure joy Jack had seen from her since she'd appeared in his pasture. "Could we go now? Just to meet her, I mean. I don't think I'm ready to actually ride yet." Jack glanced at the kitchen clock, noting that the afternoon was wearing toward evening. The temperature would be dropping soon, and Emma had been through enough physical stress for one day. But something in her expression told him that this wasn't a request that could wait for more convenient timing. "We can go see her," he said, "but you'll need warmer clothes. Montana evenings don't forgive optimism about the weather." Jack found an old barn coat of Sarah's in the mudroom, heavy canvas lined with fleece that would dwarf Emma's small frame. But keep her warm. As she struggled into the oversized garment, Jack was struck again by how young she looked, how the weight of her experiences seemed to press down on shoulders that should have been carrying nothing heavier than typical 20-something. Concerns about careers and relationships. The walk to the barn took them across the main yard where Jack had spent countless hours maintaining equipment and infrastructure. Emma moved beside him with the careful attention of someone cataloging every detail, as if she was trying to memorize a landscape she might never see again. Sarah wrote about this path, Emma said as they approached the large sliding doors that marked the barn's entrance. She said walking to the barn in the evening was like entering a different world, where time moved slower and problems seemed more manageable. Jack slid the heavy door open, releasing the familiar sense of hay and leather and the warm, comforting smell of horses at rest. The barn was dimly lit by late afternoon sunlight filtering through windows high in the loft, creating pools of golden light that made the interior feel cathedral-like in its peaceful grandeur. 3 horses lifted their heads from their evening. Hey, as Jack and Emma entered, their ears pricked forward with mild curiosity. Luna stood in the first stall, her dappled gray coat gleaming in the soft light, and Jack felt his heart clench as he remembered countless evenings when Sarah had brushed this same horse while talking through the events of her day. Emma stopped. Just inside the doorway, her eyes wide with something between wonder and fear. The horses were larger than she'd expected, their presence more imposing than any dream could have conveyed. But there was also something in her expression that spoke to recognition, as if some part of her had always known she belonged in spaces. Like this, she's beautiful, Emma whispered, her voice filled with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred spaces. Jack approached Luna's stall slowly, giving Emma time to observe the interaction before being asked to participate. The mare nickered softly and extended her muzzle toward him, accepting the gentle scratch he offered behind her ears with the dignity of a queen receiving tribute. "Luna," Jack said quietly, "I'd like you to meet Emma. She's Sarah's daughter." Emma's intake of breath was sharp and audible. It was the first time Jack had spoken those words aloud, the first time he'd claimed the relationship that had been theoretical until this moment. But saying it felt right, felt like acknowledging a truth that had been waiting for recognition. Luna's ears swiveled toward Emma, and the mare's dark eyes studied the newcomer with the careful assessment that horses use to evaluate potential threats. Emma stood perfectly still under the scrutiny, some instinct telling her that movement should be earned rather than assumed. "Can I touch her?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack opened the stall door and gestured for Emma to approach slowly. "Let her see your hand first," he instructed. Horses like to know what they're dealing with before they commit to contact. Emma extended her hand palm up, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that this moment was more significant than simple animal interaction. Luna lowered her head and breathed across Emma's palm, her nostrils flaring as she processed the scent of this new human who carried traces of someone she remembered. When Luna finally allowed Emma to stroke her neck, the contact seemed to complete some circuit that had been waiting for connection. Emma's tears came without warning, silent streams that she didn't bother to wipe away as she rested her forehead against Luna's warm neck. "She smells like Sarah," Emma said, her voice muffled against the horse's coat. Or maybe Sarah smelled like her. "There's something familiar about it, something that feels like coming home." Jack stood back and watched this communion between his wife's daughter and his wife's horse, feeling emotions shift and settle in his chest like sediment finding its proper place in still water. The scene before him felt both miraculous and inevitable, as if Sarah had somehow orchestrated this meeting from beyond the grave. "Sarah spent hours out here," Jack said softly, "especially during the worst parts of her illness when the house felt too small and the future felt too uncertain. She said the horses didn't care about her diagnosis or her prognosis. They just cared about whether she showed up with kindness and carrots." Emma lifted her head from Luna's neck but kept her hand resting on the mare's shoulder. "She wrote about that," she said. "About how the animals here taught her the difference between sympathy and presence. She said sympathy tried to fix things, but presence just offered companionship without judgment." Jack nodded, remembering conversations with Sarah about the weight of other people's reactions to her illness. She'd grown tired of being treated like a tragedy, of having every interaction filtered through pity or false optimism. The animals had offered her something simpler and more valuable: acceptance without agenda. Did she ride during her treatment? Emma asked, continuing to stroke Luna's neck with growing confidence. Jack's expression darkened as he remembered. Those difficult months. At first, yes. But as the chemotherapy progressed, she became too weak and too unsteady. The last time she rode was about 6 months before she died, and even then, I had to help her mount and stay close beside her the entire time. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing the image of Sarah struggling with activities that had once brought her joy. Was she afraid? She asked finally. Of dying, I mean. Jack considered the question, remembering late-night conversations. When Sarah's guard was down and the reality of her situation couldn't be avoided with daylight optimism. She was afraid of suffering, he said honestly. Afraid of becoming a burden, afraid of leaving me alone. But death itself, I think she made peace with that before the end. Emma turned to face him fully, her hand still maintaining contact with Luna. She wrote about that too. About how dying was just another transition, like being born or falling in love. She said the hard part wasn't the ending, but trusting that the people left behind would find ways to keep living. Jack felt tears prick his eyes at the familiar echo of Sarah's philosophy. She'd approached her illness with the same practical grace she'd brought to every other challenge in their life together, focusing on what could be controlled rather than raging against what couldn't be changed. I haven't done a very good job of that, Jack admitted. The living part, I mean. I've been existing, maintaining, going through the motions, but actual living, that stopped when she did. Emma studied his face with an intensity that reminded him powerfully of Sarah when she was working through a complex problem. Maybe that's why I'm here, she said quietly. Maybe Sarah knew you'd need a reason to start again, and she arranged for me to show up when you were ready. Jack felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the grip he'd maintained. On his grief for 8 years, the idea that Sarah might have somehow orchestrated Emma's arrival, that his wife's love might extend beyond death to bring him exactly what he needed when he needed it, was both impossible and completely consistent with the woman he'd married. She was always good at timing, Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. Always seemed to know when I needed pushing and when I needed space. Emma smiled, and for the first time since her arrival, the expression reached her eyes. She told me you were stubborn but worth the effort. She said breaking through your defenses was like earning the trust of a wild animal. You had to be patient and consistent and never try to force the connection. Jack laughed despite himself, recognizing the accuracy of Sarah's assessment. He'd always been slow to trust, careful with his affections, prone to retreat rather than risk vulnerability. Sarah had indeed approached their relationship with the patience of someone gentling a skittish horse. And what about you? Jack asked, watching Emma continue to stroke Luna's neck. Are you worth the effort too? Emma's hand stilled on the horse's coat, and Jack saw her processing the question with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to assume kindness from adults. I don't know, she said honestly. I've never been given the chance to find out. Jack felt his heart break a little at the simple honesty of her response. This girl had lived 24 years without anyone investing enough in her well-being to discover what she might become given genuine care and attention. The waste of it, the casual cruelty of a system that had failed her so completely, made him angry in ways he hadn't felt since Sarah's diagnosis. Well, Jack said, moving to stand beside Emma at Luna's stall. I guess we'll find out together. Emma looked at him with surprise and something that might have been the beginning of trust. You mean I can stay? At least for a while? Jack hadn't consciously made the decision until he heard himself speaking. But once the words were out, he realized they felt more right than anything he'd said in years. "Sarah wanted you to have a safe place to heal," he said. "She trusted me to provide that. I'm not going to let her down." Emma's tears came harder now, but they seemed cleaner somehow, less weighted with despair and more touched with relief. "I don't know how to be part of a family," she said. "I don't know the rules or the expectations. I might disappoint you." Jack reached out slowly and placed his hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension in her muscles and the way she held herself, ready to flee at the first sign of threat. "There aren't any rules," he said gently. "Just two people figuring out how to honor someone we both loved. We'll make mistakes, probably lots of them, but we'll figure it out as we go." Luna whinnied softly, as if offering her own approval of the arrangement, and Emma laughed through her tears. The sound was rusty from disuse, but genuine, and Jack felt something that had been frozen in his chest begin to thaw. As they walked back to the house in the gathering dusk, Emma asked questions about the ranch operations, about the cattle and the seasonal rhythms that governed life in this remote corner of Montana. Jack found himself talking more than he had in years, sharing not just information but stories, memories of good years and bad years, and the steady satisfaction of work that connected him to the land. "Sarah was right," Emma said as they reached the porch. "This place does feel like sanctuary, like the kind of place where broken things can heal." Jack looked up at the house where he'd spent the happiest years of his life and the most difficult years since, seeing it through Emma's eyes as a place of refuge rather than retreat. "Maybe that's what it's meant to be," he said. "A place where people can stop running long enough to remember who they're supposed to become." Emma paused at the front door, her hand on the handle, but her attention focused on something beyond the immediate moment. "I dreamed about this place," she said quietly. "Before Sarah contacted me, before I knew it existed. I used to dream about a house that felt like home, with people who wanted me there just because I was me. I thought it was just wishful thinking." Jack felt tears prick his eyes at the simple honesty of her words. "Maybe some dreams are less about wishful thinking and more about navigation," he said. "Maybe they're showing us where we're supposed to end up." Emma smiled and opened the door, stepping into the warmth and light of the house that was beginning to feel less like a museum and more like a home. As Jack followed her inside, he felt Sarah's presence in the space between them, not as a ghost, but as a bridge, connecting two wounded souls who might just be exactly what each other needed. The evening stretched ahead of them, full of conversations yet to be had and connections yet to be forged. For the first time in 8 years, Jack looked forward to tomorrow, curious about what new understanding might emerge from the strange alchemy of shared grief and tentative hope. Emma was Sarah's daughter, but she was also becoming something else, the catalyst that might finally help him remember how to live instead of simply surviving. Outside, the wind carried the scent of approaching winter across the valley, but inside the house, something warmer was beginning to grow. It would take time to fully bloom, would require patience and care and the kind of faith that Sarah had always embodied. But the seeds were planted now, watered by tears, and tended by the careful attention of two people learning to trust each other with the most fragile parts of their hearts. Jack closed the door behind them and turned the lock, not against intruders, but in favor of the sanctuary they were building together. For the first time since Sarah's death, the house felt alive again, filled with the possibility of laughter and conversation, and the kind of everyday miracles that happen when strangers choose to become family. Emma hung up the barn coat and moved toward the kitchen, already comfortable enough to assume she belonged in the domestic rhythms of the house. "Should I help with dinner?" she asked, and Jack realized that this simple question marked the beginning of something new. Something that honored Sarah's memory while creating space for the future she'd wanted them to share. "I'd like that," Jack said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. Sarah always said cooking was better with company. As they moved together toward the kitchen, Jack felt the weight of 8 years of solitude beginning to lift. Emma was Sarah's final gift to him, the daughter, who would teach him how to be part of a family again. And perhaps in time, he could be the father figure she'd never had. The steady presence that would help her understand that some people could be trusted with the tender places in her heart. The evening ahead promised to be full of small discoveries and gentle revelations of two people learning to navigate the complex territory between stranger and family. It wouldn't be easy. There would be misunderstandings and moments of doubt, old wounds that needed careful tending, and new hurts that would require forgiveness. But for now, it was enough to be together in Sarah's kitchen, preparing a meal that would nourish both body and spirit. It was enough to know that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for understanding, new chances to honor the woman who had brought them together across time and distance, and the seemingly impossible barriers that had kept them apart. Emma was home, and Jack was beginning to remember what that word actually meant. The weeks that followed Emma's arrival settled into a rhythm that surprised Jack with its naturalness. Each morning brought small discoveries about living with another person after years of solitude, and each evening brought conversations that gradually filled the silence that had defined his existence since Sarah's death. Emma moved through the house with increasing confidence, no longer jumping at every sound or positioning herself near exits as if preparing for sudden flight. She helped with the daily ranch work, learning to feed the cattle and check fence lines, with the eager attention of someone who had never been trusted with meaningful responsibility. Her hands, soft from years of institutional living, gradually developed the calluses that marked honest work, and Jack found himself looking forward to her questions about everything from soil composition to weather patterns. The nightmares came in the third week. Jack woke to the sound of Emma screaming, her voice raw with terror as she called out names he didn't recognize and pleaded with invisible attackers to leave her alone. He found her in the kitchen at 3 a.m, fully dressed and clutching a bag as if she'd been preparing to run, her eyes wild with the kind of fear that comes from deep places where logic cannot reach. "I'm sorry," she whispered when she saw him, her voice shaking with exhaustion and shame. "I was dreaming about the Hendersons, about Mr. Henderson coming to take me back. I know it's stupid, but I can't stop thinking that someone's going to show up and drag me away from here." Jack sat across from her at the kitchen table, careful not to move too quickly or speak too loudly. He'd dealt with spooked animals enough to recognize the signs of fight or flight response, the way trauma could hijack rational thought and leave someone operating on pure survival instinct. "It's not stupid," he said quietly. "When you've been hurt the way you have, your mind keeps trying to protect you from it happening again. Sometimes that protection shows up as nightmares." Emma's hands were shaking as she set down her bag, and Jack could see the effort it took for her to force her breathing into something resembling normal rhythm. "Sarah wrote about your nightmares," she said suddenly. "After she died. She said you used to wake up fighting invisible enemies, trying to save her from the cancer." Jack felt heat rise in his cheeks. He'd thought his nighttime struggles had been private, that his thrashing and muttering hadn't been loud enough to wake Sarah during her final months. The idea that she'd been aware of his subconscious battles, while fighting her own very real ones, made him feel exposed and guilty. "I didn't know she knew," he said. Emma's smile was sad but understanding. "She said you were the kind of man who tried to carry everyone else's pain so they wouldn't have to bear it alone. She worried about what would happen to all that protective energy when she was gone." Jack looked at this young woman who seemed to understand him in ways he'd never understood himself, who spoke about Sarah's observations with the reverence of someone preserving sacred texts. What did she think would happen to it? "She hoped you'd find someone else to protect," Emma said simply. "Someone who needed what you had to offer." She said loving you had taught her that some people are natural guardians, that they need to feel useful in order to feel whole. The words hit Jack like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel, but because they were accurate in ways that made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. He'd always seen his protective instincts as natural responses to Sarah's needs, but perhaps they were deeper than that. Part of some fundamental architecture of his personality that required purpose to function properly. "Is that why you came here?" he asked. "Because Sarah thought I needed someone to take care of?" Emma shook her head, her expression growing more serious. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go. But maybe Sarah knew that two broken people might be able to help each other heal in ways that wouldn't work alone." Jack considered this, thinking about the gradual changes he'd noticed in himself since Emma's arrival. The house felt more alive. His days had more structure and purpose. And for the first time in 8 years, he found himself planning for a future that extended beyond simple maintenance of the present. "Are you healing?" he asked. Emma was quiet. For a long moment, her eyes focused on something beyond the kitchen window where the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. "I think so," she said finally. "For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of tomorrow. I don't wake up wondering if today will be the day someone decides I'm too much trouble to keep around." Jack felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "You're not too much trouble," he said. "You're exactly the right amount of trouble." Emma laughed, and the sound was lighter than any he'd heard from her before. "Sarah said you had a way of making people feel like they belonged, even when they weren't sure they wanted to." "She was generous with her assessments," Jack said. "I've spent 8 years proving I'm better at isolation than connection." "Maybe you just needed the right person to connect with," Emma suggested. "Someone who understood that healing isn't linear, that some wounds take longer to close than others." Jack stood and moved to the coffee maker, needing the familiar ritual to ground himself in the present moment. The conversation was touching places in his heart that had been sealed off for years, and he felt simultaneously grateful for the connection and terrified of what it might mean for the careful, emotional equilibrium he'd maintained since Sarah's death. "I want to show you something," Emma said suddenly, disappearing upstairs and returning with a small wooden box that Jack recognized as one of Sarah's jewelry containers. "I found this in the letter she sent me. She said she'd been keeping it for the right moment, but the cancer moved too fast for her to give it to me herself." Emma opened the box to reveal a simple gold chain holding a small pendant in the shape of a horse in mid-gallop. The craftsmanship was delicate, but sturdy, the kind of piece that was meant to be worn rather than admired from a distance. "She had it made by a jeweler in Billings," Emma said, lifting the necklace from its velvet nest. "She said it represented the freedom she'd always wanted me to have, the ability to run toward things instead of away from them." Jack felt his throat tighten as he imagined Sarah sitting in some sterile medical office, planning gifts for a daughter she might never meet while her own body betrayed her day by day. The thoughtfulness of it, the hope embedded in such a simple gesture, spoke to the depths of love that had driven Sarah to reach out across 20 years of separation. "She wanted me to wear it when I was ready to stop running," Emma continued. "When I found a place that felt like home and people who wanted me to stay." Emma handed the necklace to Jack, and he accepted it with the reverence due to sacred objects. The chain was warm from her touch, and the pendant caught the kitchen light in ways that made it seem almost alive. "Would you help me put it on?" Emma asked, turning to present her back to him. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he fastened the clasp, his fingers brushing against the soft skin at the nape of Emma's neck. When she turned around, the pendant rested just above her heart, and Jack was struck by how right it looked there, how it seemed to complete some picture he hadn't realized was missing pieces. "How does it feel?" he asked. Emma's hand moved to touch the pendant, and her smile was brighter than any sunrise Jack had ever witnessed. "Like coming home," she said simply. "Like finally understanding what Sarah meant when she wrote about belonging." Jack felt tears prick his eyes, and for the first time in 8 years, They weren't tears of grief, but of something more complex and hopeful. "She would be so proud of you," he said. "Of the woman you've become, of the courage it took to find your way here." Emma's eyes filled with tears that seemed to contain equal parts sorrow and joy. "I wish I could have met her," she said. "I wish I could have thanked her for giving me life twice, once when she carried me, and again when she brought us together." Jack pulled Emma into a hug, feeling her slight frame shake with emotions too large for her body to contain. She clung to him with the desperation of someone who had never been held without conditions, who had never felt the simple comfort of unconditional acceptance. "She's still bringing us together," Jack said into Emma's hair. "Every day we choose to be family. Every time we help each other heal, she's part of that. Love doesn't end with death, it just changes form." They stood in the growing light of dawn, two wounded souls finding strength in their shared connection to a woman who had loved them, both enough to trust them with each other. The kitchen around them felt charged with possibility, as if Sarah's presence was blessing this moment of recognition and commitment. When they finally separated, Emma wiped her eyes and moved to the window where the sun was painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. "I want to learn to ride Luna today," she said with sudden determination. "I want to feel what Sarah felt when she was on horseback, that sense of freedom and connection she wrote about." Jack nodded, understanding that this was Emma's way of honoring Sarah's memory while claiming her own future. "We'll start slow," he said. "Luna's patient, but learning to ride is as much about trust as it is about technique." "I'm ready to trust," Emma said, turning from the window to face him. "I'm ready to stop being afraid of everything that might go wrong and start focusing on what might go right." Jack felt pride swell in his chest as he looked at this remarkable young woman who had survived so much and still found the courage to hope for better. "Sarah would say that's the most important lesson anyone can learn," he said. "That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act despite it." They spent the morning preparing for Emma's first riding lesson, checking equipment and discussing safety, while Luna watched from her stall with the patient attention of a teacher waiting for class to begin. Emma's nervous energy was palpable, but underneath it Jack could sense excitement and determination that hadn't been there when she'd first arrived. The lesson itself was a revelation. Emma's natural affinity for the horse was evident from the moment she mounted, her body finding balance and rhythm with an ease that spoke to some deep genetic memory. Luna responded to her gentle guidance with the kind of trust that usually took weeks to develop, and Jack found himself watching in amazement as two beings who had never met before found perfect harmony together. "This is what Sarah meant," Emma called out as Luna carried her in slow circles around the paddock. "This feeling of being connected to something larger than yourself, of moving in partnership instead of struggling alone." Jack watched from the fence line, his heart full of emotions he couldn't name. The scene before him felt like a gift from Sarah, a moment of pure joy that honored her memory while creating new possibilities for the future. Emma's laughter rang across the valley, and Jack realized he was witnessing the emergence of someone who had been buried under years of institutional neglect and casual cruelty. After the lesson, as they cooled down Luna and put away equipment, Emma grew contemplative. "I want to stay," she said suddenly. "Not just for a few weeks or months, but really stay. I want to help you run this ranch, learn everything Sarah would have taught me, build the kind of life she dreamed about for all of us." Jack felt his heart skip a beat at the simple honesty of her request. The idea of permanent companionship, of having someone to share not just the work, but the daily rhythms of ranch life, was both terrifying and appealing in ways he hadn't expected. "What about your legal situation?" he asked practically. "The stolen car, the foster care system, all the complications you were running from?" Emma's expression grew serious but not defeated. "I've been thinking about that. I want to contact a lawyer, face whatever consequences there are for running away and taking their car." I want to clear my name and start fresh, but I want to do it from here, with you supporting me." Jack felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "We'll figure it out together," he said. "Whatever you need to do to make things right, you won't have to do it alone." Emma's smile was radiant with relief and gratitude. "Sarah was right about you," she said. "You really are the kind of man who makes people feel safe enough to be brave." Jack felt heat rise in his cheeks at the compliment, but also a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for years. "Sarah was right about a lot of things," he said, "including the fact that some families are created by choice rather than biology." Emma launched herself into his arms, and Jack caught her with the automatic response of someone who had learned to be a safe harbor for wounded souls. "Does that mean you'll be my dad?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Jack felt tears spill over at the simple question, at the trust and hope it represented. "If you want me to be," he said, "I'd be honored to be your father, Emma, not just legally, but in all the ways that matter." Emma pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with tears and joy. "Sarah said you were the best man she'd ever known," she said. "She said if she couldn't raise me herself, she couldn't think of anyone she'd trust more to help me become who I'm meant to be." Jack felt the weight of that trust settle on his shoulders like a mantle he was finally ready to wear. "Then we'll make her proud," he said. "Both of us together." As they walked back to the house, Jack felt the last of his resistance to change and connection crumble away. Emma wasn't just Sarah's daughter or his houseguest or even his ward, she was his family. Chosen and claimed and cherished in ways that transcended biology or law or any other artificial boundary. The house welcomed them with familiar warmth, but now it felt like a home again rather than a museum. Emma's presence had breathed life back into rooms that had been holding their breath for 8 years, and Jack found himself looking forward to the future with anticipation rather than dread. That evening, as they sat on the porch swing that Sarah had loved, watching the sun set over the valley, Emma leaned against Jack's shoulder with the comfortable ease of someone who had finally found her place in the world. "Thank you," she said, quietly, "for letting me stay, for choosing to be my family, for honoring Sarah's memory by loving me." Jack wrapped his arm around her shoulders, feeling the weight of responsibility and the lightness of joy in equal measure. "Thank you," he said in return, "for helping me remember how to live instead of just surviving, for giving me a reason to believe in tomorrow." Emma's hand found the horse pendant at her throat, and Jack knew she was thinking about Sarah, about the woman who had brought them together across time and distance and seemingly impossible circumstances. The wind carried the scent of autumn across the valley, but also the promise of spring to come, of new growth and fresh beginnings. "She knew," Emma said softly. "Somehow Sarah knew that we'd need each other, that we'd both be better together than we ever could be apart." Jack looked out at the land that had been his refuge and was now becoming his foundation, at the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, at the barn where Luna waited for tomorrow's ride. Everything looked the same as it had for 30 years, but everything felt different now, charged with possibility and purpose. "She always was good at seeing the big picture," Jack said, "even when the rest of us were too close to the details to understand what was really happening." Emma settled more comfortably against his side, and Jack felt the peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and uncertainties, but also full of the kind of love that transcends loss and creates new possibilities from the ashes of old grief. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged in the darkening sky, two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful from their shared wounds. Sarah's presence surrounded them like a blessing, not as a ghost, but as a bridge between what was lost and what was being born. Jack closed his eyes and felt gratitude wash over him like warm water. Emma had arrived naked and screaming in his pasture, a broken girl fleeing horrors he could barely imagine. Now she was becoming the daughter he'd never known he needed. The family that would carry Sarah's memory forward into a future bright with promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to learn and grow and love. But tonight, it was enough to sit together on Sarah's favorite swing, watching the valley settle into peaceful darkness, knowing that they had found their way home at last. The winter months that followed brought changes to Copper Ridge Ranch that went beyond the seasonal transformation of the landscape. Snow blanketed the valley in pristine white, creating a world that felt both isolated and perfect, and Emma adapted to the rhythms of cold weather, ranching with the enthusiasm of someone who had never experienced the satisfaction of meaningful work. Jack found himself teaching her skills he'd taken for granted for decades, watching her face light up as she learned to read weather patterns, understand cattle behavior, and maintain equipment that kept their operation running smoothly. Her questions were endless and intelligent, revealing a mind that had been starved for genuine education and was now absorbing knowledge with the desperation of someone making up for lost time. The legal complications Emma had feared proved less insurmountable than expected. With the help of a lawyer from Billings who specialized in foster care cases, they discovered that the Hendersons had reported their car stolen, but had been reluctant to press charges when it became clear that doing so would invite scrutiny into Mr. Henderson's behavior toward his foster children. The case was quietly resolved with Emma agreeing to community service and restitution, both of which Jack was happy to arrange through local connections. More importantly, the lawyer helped Emma navigate the process of legally establishing her independence and clearing her record of any charges that might prevent her from building a normal life. Jack watched her handle these adult responsibilities with growing pride, seeing in her careful attention to detail and respectful communication the emergence of the woman Sarah had hoped she would become. Emma's transformation was visible in ways that went beyond legal documents and social workers' reports. The hollow look of chronic hunger disappeared as she gained weight on Jack's steady cooking and her own growing culinary skills. The defensive set of her shoulders softened as she learned to trust that safety wasn't temporary. Most remarkably, she began to laugh with genuine delight rather than the careful amusement of someone who had learned that joy could be dangerous. The ranch itself seemed to respond to Emma's presence with renewed vitality. The animals particularly. Luna showed the kind of contentment that comes from having humans who understand their needs and respect their intelligence. Even the cattle, which had always been well cared for under Jack's management, seemed more settled and productive, as if they sensed the return of feminine energy to their environment. Spring arrived early that year, with snow melting in March, and the first wildflowers appearing in April meadows still crisp with frost. Emma threw herself into the work of preparing Sarah's garden for planting, studying seed catalogs with the intensity of a scholar and asking Jack to share every detail he could remember about his wife's gardening philosophy. She always said the secret was listening to what the land wanted to grow rather than forcing it to accept what you thought it should produce. Jack explained as they walked through the still dormant beds where Sarah had spent so many happy hours. She'd study the soil composition, the drainage patterns, the way the sun moved across the space throughout the day, and then choose plants that would thrive in those specific conditions. Emma knelt beside the raised bed where Sarah had grown her herbs, running her fingers through soil that was still cold but beginning to show signs of life underneath the surface. She wrote about this in her letters, Emma said, about how gardening taught her patience and acceptance, about working with nature instead of against it. Jack watched Emma examine the emerging shoots of perennial plants that had survived another Montana winter, noting the careful way she touched each green spear as if greeting an old friend. Her instinctive understanding of growing things suggested genetic inheritance, a connection to Sarah that went beyond shared features and into the realm of shared passions. "Would you like to expand it?" Jack asked suddenly, surprised by his own suggestion. "The garden, I mean." "There's plenty of space," And Sarah always talked about adding a greenhouse so she could start seeds earlier and extend the growing season. Emma's eyes widened with excitement and something that might have been disbelief. "You'd let me do that? Change things that Sarah built?" Jack felt his throat tighten at the question, understanding that Emma was asking about more than garden modifications. She was asking whether she had permission to put her own stamp on this place, to make changes that would honor Sarah's memory while creating space for her own dreams. Sarah would want the garden to grow and change, Jack said carefully. She'd want you to make it yours while keeping the best of what she started. That's how living things work. They build on what came before while reaching toward what comes next. Emma's smile was radiant as she stood and brushed soil from her hands. "I have so many ideas," she said, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. "Vegetables that would do well in this climate, flowers that would attract beneficial insects, maybe even a small orchard if the land would support it." Jack found himself caught up in her excitement, imagining the expansion and improvement of Sarah's beloved garden under Emma's eager hands. The project would give them something to work on together through the growing season, a shared goal that would create new memories while honoring old ones. "We'll need to order materials soon if we want to get started this spring," Jack said, already mentally calculating costs and logistics. "Lumber for raised beds, soil amendments, seeds and seedlings." Emma's expression grew serious as practical. Concerns intruded on her dreams. "I don't have money to contribute," she said quietly. "I can't pay for materials or even my own food and shelter. I know I'm a burden, even if you're too kind to say so." Jack felt anger flash through him at the self-deprecation in her voice, at the way years of institutional neglect had taught her to see herself as a liability rather than an asset. "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You're family. And families invest in each other's dreams because that's how you build something lasting." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but they seemed to be tears of relief rather than sadness. "I don't know how to accept generosity," she said. "I've never had anyone who wanted to give me things without expecting something in return." Jack pulled her into a hug, feeling the familiar protectiveness that Emma's vulnerability always triggered in him. "Then you'll learn," he said simply. "The same way you learned to ride Luna and manage cattle and all the other things that seemed impossible when you first arrived." The garden project became the focus of their spring and summer, with Emma throwing herself into research and planning with the dedication of someone who had finally found work that felt like calling rather than obligation. She corresponded with agricultural extension agents, visited other local gardens to observe techniques, and filled notebook after notebook with detailed plans and observations. Jack found himself rediscovering the ranch through Emma's eyes, seeing possibilities he'd overlooked and solutions to problems he'd accepted as unchangeable. Her fresh perspective challenged assumptions he'd held for decades, pushing him to consider new approaches to everything from pasture management to equipment maintenance. The physical work of garden expansion proved therapeutic for both of them. Jack's body, which had grown stiff from 8 years of solitary routine, loosened and strengthened as he helped Emma dig beds and build structures. Emma's soft hands developed calluses, and her thin frame gained muscle as she learned to handle tools and materials with growing confidence. More importantly, the shared labor created opportunities for conversation that deepened their understanding of each other. Working side by side with soil and seeds, they talked about everything from Emma's memories of foster care to Jack's experiences growing up on his family's ranch. The rhythm of physical work seemed to unlock emotional honesty, creating space for revelations that might have felt too vulnerable in other contexts. "I used to steal books from libraries," Emma confessed one afternoon as they transplanted tomato seedlings into their new greenhouse. "Not because I wanted to keep them, but because I was afraid I wouldn't get to finish them before we moved to a new placement. I'd hide them in my clothes until I was done reading, then sneak them back." Jack paused in his planting, struck by The image of a young Emma so desperate for knowledge and continuity that she'd risk punishment for the simple pleasure of finishing a story. "What kind of books?" he asked. "Everything," Emma said, her hands gentle with the delicate seedlings. "Fiction, biography, gardening manuals, veterinary textbooks, anything that could teach me about worlds different from the ones I was living in. I think books kept me sane during the worst placements." Jack thought about his own relationship with reading, how Sarah had filled their house with books and encouraged him to explore subjects beyond his immediate experience. The idea that Emma had been fighting for the same kind of intellectual expansion under much more difficult circumstances made him admire her resilience even more. "Sarah would have loved that about you," Jack said. "She believed reading was a form of freedom, a way to travel beyond the limitations of your immediate circumstances." Emma's smile was soft with memory. "She sent me books in her letters. Poetry, mostly, but also essays about finding meaning in difficult situations. I still have them all, marked up with notes and questions I wanted to ask her someday." Jack felt the familiar pang that came with reminders of all the conversations Sarah and Emma would never have, all the shared experiences that cancer had stolen from them. But increasingly, these moments of loss were balanced by gratitude for the connection that had survived death. Brought Emma into his life. As summer progressed, the expanded garden became a showcase of Emma's growing expertise and artistic vision. She'd created themed sections that flowed naturally into each other: culinary herbs near the kitchen door, cutting flowers in wide beds that provided bouquets for the house, vegetables arranged for both productivity and beauty. The greenhouse allowed for extended seasons and experimentation with varieties that wouldn't normally thrive in Montana's challenging climate. Visitors to the ranch, mostly neighbors and delivery drivers, began commenting on the transformation with the kind of admiration that made Jack's chest swell with pride. Emma had taken Sarah's foundation and built something uniquely her own while honoring the principles and aesthetics that had made the original garden special. "You've got quite an operation here," Billy Crawford observed during one of his regular visits, his eyes taking in the neat rows and thriving plants. "Emma's got real talent for this kind of work." Jack nodded, watching Emma deadhead flowers with the focused attention she brought to everything she cared about. "She's a natural," he said. "Sarah would be amazed at what she's accomplished." Billy's expression grew thoughtful as he studied Emma's work. "You know, there's good money in specialty crops around here. Restaurants in Billings and even some places in Helena are always looking for unusual varieties and high-quality organic produce. Emma might consider selling some of her surplus." The suggestion planted a seed that grew quickly in Emma's entrepreneurial mind. Within weeks, she was researching market opportunities and calculating potential profits from specialty vegetables and cut flowers. The idea of turning her passion into income appealed to her on multiple levels, offering both financial independence and validation of her skills. Jack supported her business planning with the same enthusiasm he'd brought to the garden expansion, helping her understand local regulations and connecting her with potential customers through his network of ranching contacts. Watching Emma present her ideas to restaurant owners and farmers market coordinators, he was struck by her natural confidence and communication skills, qualities that had been hidden under years of defensive self-protection. The first sales came in late summer, modest transactions that nonetheless filled Emma with pride disproportionate to their monetary value. She'd grown food that other people wanted to buy and eat, creating value through her own knowledge and labor in ways that felt miraculous after years of being treated as a drain on social resources. "I made $47 today," Emma announced after her first farmer's market, her face glowing with accomplishment as she counted bills and coins with careful attention. $47 from tomatoes and flowers I grew myself." Jack felt tears prick his eyes at her excitement, understanding that this wasn't really about money, but about proof of worth. evidence that she could contribute something valuable to the world. "Sarah would be so proud," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emma's expression grew serious as she looked at the money in her hands. "I want to contribute to household expenses," she said. "I want to pay for my own food and clothes, maybe even help with ranch maintenance costs." Jack shook his head, understanding her need for independence, but unwilling to accept payment from someone he considered family. "Keep your money for your own dreams," he said. "Invest it in expanding the business or saving for things you want. Family takes care of family." Emma's protests were gentle but persistent, revealing deep-seated beliefs about earning her place and avoiding debt that went beyond financial calculations into psychological necessity. They eventually compromised on a plan where Emma would contribute to specific projects she wanted to undertake, maintaining her sense of agency while preserving Jack's ability to provide for someone he loved. As autumn approached, bringing with it the first anniversary of Emma's arrival, both of them reflected on the magnitude of the changes a single year had brought. The frightened girl who had appeared naked in Jack's pasture had been replaced by a confident young woman who was building a life rather than merely surviving one. Jack found himself changed as well, transformed from a man who maintained routines into someone who embraced possibilities. Emma's presence had reminded him that growth was still possible at any age, that love could take new forms even after devastating loss. The anniversary itself passed quietly, marked by a special dinner and Emma's insistence on recreating the menu Sarah had described in one of her letters. They cooked together in the kitchen where they'd shared so many conversations, their movements synchronized by months of domestic partnership. "Thank you," Emma said as they cleaned up after the meal, her voice carrying the weight of everything she couldn't fully express. "For saving my life, for choosing to be my father, for helping me become someone I actually like." Jack sat down, the dish he'd been drying, and pulled Emma into a hug that contained a year's worth of accumulated affection and gratitude. "Thank you," he said in return, "for saving mine, for choosing to be my daughter, for helping me remember what it means to hope for tomorrow." They stood together in Sarah's kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together, and Jack felt the presence of his wife like a blessing on everything they'd created. Sarah had trusted him with her most precious gift, and he'd learned to be worthy of that trust. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, dusting the valley with white and marking the beginning of another winter cycle. But inside the house, warmth radiated from more than just the fire in the hearth. It came from the knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged, with exactly the people they were meant to love. Emma was no longer the naked girl screaming his dead wife's name. She was his daughter, chosen and cherished, the living bridge between Sarah's memory and their shared future. And Jack was no longer the broken rancher who had lived alone for 30 years. He was a father, a teacher, a guardian of dreams both fulfilled and still growing. The story that had begun with mystery and trauma had transformed into something beautiful and lasting, proof that love could transcend death and create new possibilities from the ashes of old grief. Sarah's final gift had been the daughter who would help Jack remember how to live. And his gift to Sarah was the promise that Emma would always have a home where she was valued for exactly who she was. As they settled in for another Montana winter, Jack looked forward to spring with anticipation rather than mere endurance. There would be new gardens to plant, new dreams to nurture, new memories to create in the house that had learned to be a home again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.